Hello, everybody. Welcome to What Would Your Ideal World Be? A new podcast which examines many important people and the important things in their lives, what they think about most current trends at the moment, what they think about certain subject matters, and of course, what their ideal world would be. As part of a special series covering the Old Bexley Sidcup by-election, today's guest is Richard Hewison, who is running under the Rejoin EU Party banner. Hewison has been involved in politics since the 1980s while fighting for LGBT rights, and has been the leader of the Rejoin EU Party since its founding in February 2020. Okay, thank you for coming on. And the first question I wanted to ask you was, for hypothetical sake, you've just been elected as the MP for Old Bexley Sidcup in this by-election, and you just entered the Houses of Parliament for the first time. What is the first major policy that you seek to achieve while there, and who would you like to work with in order to achieve that aim?
Well, in the event of being elected as an MP, let's be clear, we're not expecting that to happen in this election. But yeah, obviously, one of the things I've always believed quite strongly is the parliamentary system. If you do ever get elected, you should work for the constituents that elect you. The first thing I would sadly have to do is put my party affiliation aside and pledge to work for the good of all the citizens in Old Bexley and Sidcup should I become elected. There's such a wide range of people in Sidcup and Bexley that I spoke to so far, with such a wide range of issues. And of course, people know what my position is because I come from the Rejoin EU Party. But I think you really have to make sure that you are there for everyone to be able to approach you and your office in terms of problems. And one of the things I would pay tribute to my predecessor, the previous MP, I should say. But obviously, we're not expecting to get anywhere close to being elected in Bexley and Sidcup. But if I was, of course, I would be there to serve the constituents. Now, one of the things I've quite clearly said in my manifesto is I do believe that this particular government should be held to account for what it's done. I think there's far too much temerity, or timidity, I should say, in terms of the opposition parties putting on record how corrupt this particular government has been. And the first thing I would do is try to get some extremely unparliamentary language recorded in Hansard in terms of the condemnation for the way the sleaze that we've seen recently has been handled.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I wanted to ask you from that is that what got you first involved in politics, if you don't mind me asking?
To be frank, I've always believed that being part of a democratic society, it is your duty to vote in an election and to do your best to try and judge what's going to be the best for your country to do so. In the 9 elections that I've had the chance to vote in so far, I like to think that I've tried to do that every single time. But I've now reached the stage where there is no party I can vote for, because there's no party that is actually dealing with the issues that I think are really important. Our fractured trade relationship with Europe, our isolation from the rest of the world, combined with the complete ludicrousy of the way this particular government is conducting itself, and the opposition seems to have no response to that, means if I'm going to vote in the election, I've got to vote for myself. So if I'm going to vote for myself, I have to have a party to stand for.
Mm-hmm. And funny enough, I was going to ask you on that, because in an article an interview I read for, I think it was Red Action, you talked about how you used to be, or the article itself talked about how you used to be a member of several left-wing or liberal parties like Labour, the Liberal Democrats, and the Green Party. Why weren't those parties right for you, and what can you offer left-wing voters in Bexley and Sidcup that those parties can't?
Good question. Well, let's take each party there. First of all, the Labour Party. The Labour Party is saying they want to make Brexit work. No one has any idea what they mean about that. I think what they mean about that is they want to convince their Brexit voters that they're on their side, whilst quietly trying to convince their Remain supporters that they mean closer relationships with Europe. It's a fudge, it's meaningless, and quite frankly, such 3-word buzz phrases to try and hypnotise people is dangerous. So that's why I think we offer a difference to Labour. With the Liberal Democrats, they actually have a very good candidate in the area, someone who I know is very, very pro-European themselves, but she's not able to talk about anything. And her campaign is not going to involve any discussion of Europe. Having been in Bexley for a few days myself, talking to some of the business owners there, 3 big things they're all saying. Number one, we've got inflation as a result of this. Number two, our supply chains are not working anymore. Number three, we can't get labor. The Liberal Democrats just aren't talking about that. And if they were, I would gladly stand aside and support them. And with the Green Party, obviously the Green Party has had a change of leadership recently. So it's going to be interesting to see how that beds down and if they're going to change their policies. But at the moment, all the Green Party are timidly talking about is perhaps we should reinvestigate looking at the customs union, but no mention of freedom of movement, no mention of the single market. What I would say to left of centre voters who like to look out on the world rather than look insularly at our little island is we are the only party that offers that broad global perspective at the moment.
And if I'm in that same Red Action interview, you discussed how you feel, because you were involved in gay rights activism in the 1980s, that you feel that transgender rights have come under similar threat. Why do you feel that way, and what examples can you cite that support your case, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, in terms of trans rights, you see quite a lot of really vicious, nasty anti-trans things people say all over Twitter. It does put me in mind of what the LGBT, well, it was originally the LNG debate back in the 80s. And then, of course, at that stage, there was a big debate about whether bisexual people should be welcomed into the community as well. And then, of course, that moved on to trans people as well. And it just seems we have a whole coalition of people who suffer from the same discriminatory practices in society. And if you cannot extend your empathy from how society's treated you to how society treats another group of people who society doesn't embrace, then I think your skills in relating to other people are fairly weak. So that's why I feel always obliged to stand up for trans rights if I see it coming under attack.
And on the meat and potatoes of this stuff, you are a candidate for the Rejoin EU Party. Why do you support the European Union?
Well, that's a very good question. I support the idea of the European Union because our planet is in crisis. We have uncontrolled climate change, and I think we've seen recently from things like COP26 that governments individually are not going to do anything about it. Climate change can only be dealt with by pan-national organizations. Now, if you actually have a look at the world today, in my view, there are only four power blocks that matter. Russia and China that aren't going to do anything about it, the United States that's still confused about what it's going to do, and the European Union. Now, the only way the world has a future is if those four power blocks ultimately come together and try to provide leadership for the world. So being outside any of those power blocks just doesn't make sense to me. And quite frankly, given the choice of the four on offer, I far prefer the European Union with its guarantee of human rights and its guarantee of liberal values.
And on that point, given that the seat you're running in is a safe Tory seat and has been since the days of Edward Heath, since he was their candidacy, if I'm not mistaken, in the 1980s, even before that, how do you plan to win over such voters to your side, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, so far what we've been doing is we've been talking to people. Well, the main two areas of support we found, we've visited both of the colleges and had a lot of discussions with people at the college. And the one thing I've heard several times is the line, I was 16 at the time of the referendum, why don't I get a say? And my answer is, well, obviously, you are now in your early 20s. You have much more at stake in society than perhaps someone of my age. Of course, you should have a say in that particular vote. The other big sector, of course, is business owners. And I'm going to be fair, some businesses have had no effect by Brexit at all. Talking to estate agents and recruitment agencies in Bexley, things seem to be going swimmingly there. But many other businesses that rely on suppliers coming in and labour coming in from overseas are suffering very badly. And I'm sure you're aware there's 11 candidates in this election. 5 of them think Brexit's brilliant. 5 of them don't want to talk about Brexit or have no view on Brexit at all. And then there's us. So those constituencies that are deeply angry and frustrated by that, really, we are the only party that could possibly speak for them in this particular by-election.
And just as a quick anecdote, any of those other candidates who are, maybe watching or listening to this, they're welcome on any time that they would like, and they can email me. Anyway, the next thing I wanted to ask on that subject matter, funnily enough, is that as a pro-EU candidate, how do you expect to win or maybe even do well in a seat that in the referendum voted to leave by 63%? And James Brookenshire, I know he was a pro-Remain guy, but he stood for the Conservatives under anti-EU manifestos, and he won on those manifestos both in 2017 and 19. How do
He did.
how do you expect to either win or do very well given those circumstances? How do you expect to beat those odds, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, let's not forget it's a first past the post system. Now, I don't think it's going to happen, but if we were to get 37% of the vote and the 62 was to split between the other 10 parties, then it would be a landslide victory. So with a first past the post system, when you've got so many parties chasing one part of the vote, if you are the unique constituency for another part of the vote, you can do quite well. Let's be frank, the problem we would have is credibility with those 37% of the voters. Many of them will take the view, yes, I want to rejoin the EU. Yes, I'm pro-EU. Yes, I want to see other things happening, but it's not my only issue in life. So we want to remind people about what they have lost from leaving the European Union. We want to remind them that they are in a position to be able to use their, and let's be honest, if you're in Old Bexley Sidcup, you have a unique position to make a comment on the state of politics that very, very few people have in the rest of the country. And that's why we would urge people to use us to make that voice heard.
Mm-hmm. And a final question on Brexit, at least for now anyway. Given that Brexit has happened last year and most of the major parties, as you've talked about, have conceded that point that it's happened and they're either trying to make it work or they won't talk about it, what do you feel is the point of maybe rejuvenating that debate that many feel was settled 2 years ago? And also, given how divisive it was, what do you think would be the merit of talking about that again, if you don't mind me asking?
Because it's just not working, Edward. Brexit is a disaster. I won't bore you by listing through the facts in terms of how much money has gone, how our industries are suffering. We've heard this ad infinitum, but it's like I sometimes feel I'm living in some weird world where, I don't know, the ceiling's broken and the water's coming through and everyone's standing around going, oh, well, you know, what can we do? We can't fix the ceiling because we talked about that ages ago and we decided not to do that. It's raining, the ceiling's broken, fix the ceiling. So in exactly the same way, the solution to a lot of our problems is fairly obvious. We have to fix our relationship with Europe. And indeed, one of, obviously knocking door to door in Bexley, I have talked to quite a lot of Leave voters, and I'm pretty sure they're not going to vote for us. But when you have the conversation, which basically is, look, you might not agree with me about rejoining the EU, but something needs to happen to fix our relationship with the European Union, that is the one point that people from virtually across the spectrum seem to agree on.
Mm-hmm. And on the subject of James Brookenshire, we were talking about just now, and how do you feel about his performance as an MP in the constituency you're standing in? And what do you feel his particular strengths and weaknesses were that you would take note of when, you know, succeeding him?
I think the one thing I would say in terms of talking to people about their MP, people who are very angry at the Conservative Party and how they've behaved recently talked about James with great affection. The number of people who talked to me about how he got involved with local community groups, how he helped their business, how he would forge meetings to try and bring groups together within the area. He was a brilliant constituency MP. Honestly, given that he was also Secretary of State for Northern Ireland at one point as well, and obviously a key minister in Theresa May's government, I honestly don't know how anyone had the energy to do what he did in that constituency. I think he will be a very, very hard act to follow.
Mm-hmm. And what are sort of the main top 3 issues that have been coming up for you on the doorsteps, if you don't mind me asking? You've talked probably about some of them already, but is there any other big ones that we haven't talked about?
Well, to be honest, Brexit and sleaze. People are very angry at the sleaze, very, very angry. The reactions have varied between sort of shame that these people that they voted for have turned out to be quite so corrupt in terms of their dealing partnership, to, let's be honest, people who I know are going to vote Conservative again, who just kind of look down a bit and say, oh, well, you're all the same anyway, aren't you? So nobody feels the ability to stand up for the moral values that the Conservative Party and the Conservative government seem to have stood for recently. Other than that, let's be honest, I've steered the question quite a lot onto the EU and Brexit. And as my opening line with most voters has been along the lines of, would you mind talking to me about your opinion on Brexit? We then get quite a normally a heated discussion one way or the other, and very few other topics are mentioned.
And with the issue of sleaze then, like, is it mainly just stuff with Ian Patterson, or is it just like a lot of these other cases that have sprung up in the news as well in recent days?
I don't think it's just Owen Patterson, because I think there is a deep disturbance in what happened with the other MPs in Parliament, because let's not make any bones about it. 250 Conservative MPs conspired to pervert the course of parliamentary justice in this. And that is a horrifying thing to see in a democratic society. We have a parliament which has a monarch that's not able to do anything, a House of Lords that's not willing to do anything, and a judiciary that's being disabled from doing things. We now have no international frameworks that pass obligations onto us. So I think people are very aware that this chamber that we have is now all powerful to itself. And for 250 MPs to gang together and blatantly, whatever they did afterwards is irrelevant. What they did on that day has deeply shocked and disturbed a lot of people, myself included.
And one thing I remember reading recently in the Times is the fact that a lot of the 2019 intake of Conservative MPs said a lot of them were bullied and threatened with like constituency defunding if that was, if they didn't vote the way that they U-turned on. What do you think that speaks to in terms of the Conservative Party establishment handling sort of these scandals like this?
I think it says nothing about that. I think it says something about the integrity of those MPs. If you cannot understand that perverting the course of justice is wrong, then you yourself are a wrong'un. And 250 MPs that do not understand what is right from what is wrong is a disgrace in our society. And quite frankly, if you say, oh, I was bullied, grow up. You've been elected to represent your parliament, your constituency in parliament. And if you fail to do that, you are a disgrace.
And how big how much do you think it will play into this election? Like, do you think it could maybe steer towards one of the other candidates? Do you think the Conservative might lose this time based on this issue, or
it's difficult to say? I mean, if we have a look at the figures at the general election, obviously the Conservatives had about 30,000 votes, and I think the Labour Party had about 12,000 votes at the time. So, the majority is absolutely massive. I think a lot of people are going to vote with their bottoms in this election, keeping them firmly on the sofa and not going down to the polling booth. Now, let's be honest, if we were to take an estimate of how outraged people were, perhaps a third of Conservative voters might decide this isn't the election for them. They're just going to sit it out. That still would give them a comfortable majority in this seat. So I think we're going to see a huge reduction in the Conservative vote. Personally, I'll be honest, I'm always wrong about predictions like this, but personally, I would guess at the moment it will still be a comfortable but shameful win for the Conservatives in this constituency.
And on that front, how long do you think this will play for in like the next, because there's a few other by-elections coming up, how long do you think this as an issue will play on for, do you think?
It's certainly going to play in North Shropshire. It's going to be, I think, the biggest issue in North Shropshire, because, of course, that is the epicenter of the sleaze that we've had. And not only is there the sleaze there's also the bad feeling about the speed with the election being called. I think you were probably aware that there were tentative discussions between the opposition parties about potentially standing a unity anti-sleaze candidate in this constituency to make a point. The speed at which the by-election was called, which is unprecedented. I mean, we have never seen, I can't remember ever seeing a Thursday, a seat becoming vacant and a writ going through Parliament the next Tuesday, just 2 sitting days later. The speed with which it's done has been to try and scupper any idea of a deal and basically force the opposition parties to jump there. So I think that's going to mean quite a lot of rancor in that election.
Do you think that maybe will cause perhaps a scalp? Maybe, do you think like say Tory seat up there, it might cause a scalp? What do you think?
Again, it's a very, very comfortable majority of the Conservatives there. I really do think if the opposition parties had time to come together and field a unity candidate, yes, it could have done. As it stands now, I think it's unlikely. Again, it's another seat where Labour are second, but defecting Conservatives are probably likely to go to the Lib Dems. So again, my guess would be a lot of Conservatives will stay at home. A few might be angry enough to switch, but they're going to split. And probably more of them will switch to Lib Dems, but some of them will switch to Labour, and it may end up sort of evening the race. But I would suspect a comfortable Conservative win again there.
And maybe on that subject, what do you feel about the fact, what do you feel about the possibility, what do you think could actually hurt Boris Johnson's popularity in the future to the point where he might lose a general election? Because there's a lot of public anger building maybe against Boris Johnson, not just on this issue, but several other issues that are going through the news as well. Do you think there might be like a tipping point where something might just knock it completely and he might lose the next election, perhaps?
It is difficult to see what could actually dent him. I mean, in the past, if you look at the big pivot points with perhaps prime ministers like Gordon Brown and Theresa May, I think their downfall was they'd always been perceived as very competent until they made a bit of a mess, and suddenly people thought, oh, you're not competent, are you? And that had a big knock on both of their popularities. No one's ever perceived Boris Johnson as competent. No one's ever perceived him as able to do a good job. So a lot of the dumb things that happen, his supporters are, what are you going to do? This one, I think it was so clumsy, the handling of this. I don't think the danger comes more from the electorate. I think it comes more from his backbenchers, because it goes back to what you were saying earlier on about the intake of 2019. A lot of these people will be deeply burned. It's their fault. They should have had the guts to stand up and do what was right. But a lot of them will feel very burnt. And I wouldn't be surprised to see moves to oust Boris Johnson from his own backbenchers. And quite like Margaret Thatcher, the electorate never got her, but eventually her own MPs did. And I think Boris Johnson will be the same.
And then, if this is the case, why do you think he keeps winning elections, Boris Johnson? Because he won twice as London mayor. He's also won quite a few times as MP, and now won probably the biggest Conservative landslide for 30 years, if I'm not mistaken. Why do you think he keeps? Why is so popular? Why do you think is it a matter of him being so popular, or the opposition being so unappealing to people that he stands against?
That is a good question. I don't think he has won that many elections, to be quite honest. The only big elections he's won was 2008 against Ken Livingstone, where there was quite a lot of Labour lefty anti-feeling there, and he was quite funny on the campaign. And probably with Mayor of London, a lot of people thought, oh, we might give him a chance. How much damage can he do? And then, of course, the repeat in 2012, it was a rematch. And so people just voted down the same lines. As an MP, obviously, MPs don't really win on their own merit. They win based on what their party's doing. So the only big election win he's really ever had, and I'll give him that, is the 2019 election. And quite frankly, I think that was, whatever you say about Jeremy Corbyn, the character assassination of him prior to the 2019 election. You would have thought he was one of the most evil people on the planet voting there, based on the propaganda that came out against him. And that certainly was partially the issue there, I think.
And how do you feel, this is probably the final question on this stuff, how do you feel about the fact that there was, if I'm not mistaken, a poll done recently which showed that if Johnson were to have stood in his seat of, I can't remember what it was a Ruslip seat, he would have lost that seat to, I think, the Labour candidate. How do you feel about that?
Are you talking about his current seat or his previous seat?
Yeah, his current seat, yeah. If he were to have stood, according to polling, he would have lost it.
Well, we have our own electoral model that we feed in all the polls as they come. And we put in the worst poll recently, and our model showed him holding on to his seat by 65 votes, which I think we'll agree is zero in this particular case. And when we factored in some other scenarios people were discussing, yes, he would lose it by quite a lot. It does give quite a lot of power to the voters in that particular seat. It will energize them quite a lot. To evict a sitting prime minister is quite a thing to actually do. We'll see how things come by the next election. But my guess is, if we go to the full run of Parliament, he will no longer be the prime minister at that stage.
And on that subject, given the fact that you said that all these opposition parties talk about the fact that they're weak against a lot of the stuff that's going on, do you think maybe in future, either by-elections or otherwise, that could give maybe your party some boost, a bit of a boost? Because like if people see these parties as weak and not doing anything, and you come in as a bit more of a fierce opposition, they might find you more appealing, and you might not necessarily win, but you get a bit more of a boost, and which could lead to some more wins later on.
I think the people that vote for our party do it out of, well, let's be honest, frustration. They do it because there's nobody that stands for them in this constituency. They can't bear to just suck it up and vote for the second worst party in that particular by-election just because it's there. So as more and more people get disillusioned with the opposition parties, I think parties like mine, and not just my party, will start to get more and more votes in these elections. Now, personally, I hope that that makes some of the opposition parties wise up. I'm dumbfounded by the Liberal Democrats, to be quite frank. And to me, it seems an open goal for the Liberal Democrats to be talking about repairing our ties with Europe, trying to fix some of the problems that Brexit's done, but they're just not taking it at the moment. 48% of the population voted to remain. That 48% is not being catered for by anybody except for our party at the moment.
And do you think maybe also in the future, talk about younger voters in colleges like 16 who are now in their early 20s? Do you think that might be a bit of a boosting as well? Because a lot of the 16 or 17-year-olds that couldn't vote the first time, as they get older, might want to rejoin the EU if things get really bad. So therefore, they might look to your party and think they're the only people who speak to me. Do you think that might be a benefit to you in the future for by-elections and so on?
Certainly, it could be. I hope that as we start to wind forward the years, the force of those people starts to get more and more noticeable to the large parties. And I'll be honest with you, I'm quite happy for one of the large parties to steal our clothes and start taking that issue seriously. And quite frankly, the power is with the young people. Established parties are terrified of young people coming out to vote. One of the things that we heard a lot in the 2017 election, and let's remind ourselves, in the 2017 election, Theresa May came within 1,000 votes in strategic places of being removed from office and Brexit being finished. And people were giving feedback from polling booths, how they'd never seen so many young people turn out. This is what they'd always been afraid of. Oh my goodness, what was going to happen? And they almost did it. They almost did it. I think that was probably quite heartbreaking to a lot of the new young voters in 2017, and perhaps very disillusioning when you feel momentum like that slip away. But I think next time we have another election, I hope some of that will come back.
And on that subject, you said you would hope like one of these other parties would steal your clothes, so to speak. If one of them were to do, let's say the Lib Dems become a much more vocally open pro-European party, one of these other small parties does that, and they start to do very well from that electorally, would you consider rejoining them or merging with them?
We would not stand against them in any seats that they were viable to win in that particular case. And if both them and Labour did, then maybe I would. But let's say the Liberal Democrats find a bit of backbone, get rid of their useless leader and replace him with someone who's actually cares about what the membership wants, then I think we'll see a much more openly pro-European party. And that is a party that at that stage we would not be fighting in for seats.
And would you also, why do you think the Labour Party possibly aren't taking up this moniker, given that they were very boisterous and vocal about it as recently as, say, 2019? I mean, if I'm not mistaken, Sir Keir Starmer, who was the Brexit secretary at the time, was the one who, the biggest cheerleader of the second referendum policy of his party.
Because ultimately, it's all about trying to form a majority government, or at least be the largest party in a minority. Their analysis is that people like me have no choice but to vote for them. So why should they bother to talk to us? Because, and I have to say, there's quite a lot of people that they're right about that. I speak to a lot of people saying, oh, I do want to rejoin, but I want the Tories out. And if I vote for Keir Starmer, maybe he'll be softer on this. Maybe he'll talk about PR. Well, Keir Starmer's made his position very clear. If he becomes prime minister, he's not going to talk about re-engaging with Europe. He's not going to talk about proportional representation. But while he can rely on the fact that people like me feel that there's no alternative, why should he talk to us? He might as well try and win back the Brexit leaving red wall votes in the northern constituencies.
But do you think he could just be saying that simply in order to win back those votes? One, if, like you say, he gets into power and he's a lot more brazenly pro-European in a way he probably couldn't be if, you know, he wanted to be.
This is the wrong way to run democracy, Edward. You cannot run a democracy on the basis that, this person says they're going to do this, but I think they're not. You have to run a democracy based on the fact that what politicians say is what they will actually enact when they get elected. Now, I know we've seen some shocking volte-faces in the past. I think the tuition fees debate still haunts many people from the 2010 election. But broadly speaking, you must expect the politicians to deliver on their promise. You hold them accountable when it's not. But what you can't do is all this sort of mystic megging about, oh, I have a feeling that under these circumstances, Keir Starmer will do this. No. What will happen if Keir Starmer is lucky enough to oust the Conservatives at the next election? The best polls for Labour at the moment are predicting a very fragile minority government, which they would rely on SNP votes to actually stay in for. It will be 5 years of vacillation and fudge while the Conservative Party reorganises and comes back having cleaned house with a solid majority in the next election. If you want to do something about getting back to European rights, progressing the cause of PR, you have to actually start influencing the opposition parties now.
And one thing you're talking about is proportional representation. Why do you support proportional representation as a system? And what are the benefits of it, do you think?
You have to make sure that people's voices are heard. One of the great things about the London Assembly, now the London Assembly is not perfect by any means, but whereas only 43% of the population are heard in Westminster, more than 80% of the population are heard on the Assembly. The idea of 25 seats, each of those seats representing 4% of the population, should mean that you get a representative democracy that enables everybody's voice to be proportionally weighted in decisions. Now, obviously, the irony with London is we have 25 MPs, all represent, I should say, assembly members. Yeah. MPs. We have 25 assembly members, all supposed to be representing 4% each, and yet we have a 5% minimum threshold. So sometimes who mathematically should be elected is not who actually is elected. So proportional representation in its various ilks is not perfect, but it certainly does mean that there's an improvement in representative voices.
If I'm not mistaken, one thing I've read about, I'm not sure if this is correct, but I could be wrong on this, is that during Tony Blair's era, if I'm not mistaken, people like Peter Mandelson and people like Roy Jenkins were egging him on to essentially put in proportional representation, make it replace first past the post. Why do you think he never had the guts to go ahead with it, do you think?
Well, this is the sad thing, because it's almost like Groundhog Day. To a large extent, I almost feel like I'm back in 1990. Because in 1990, all the talk was proportional representation. We need to stop these Conservative governments having a minority of the vote and getting in power. The 92 election obviously was a wash. John Major got back in with a wafer-thin majority and ruled for 5 years. And everyone's, oh, PR, PR. And then, of course, Tony Blair came along and won a landslide. And suddenly it's, oh, well, now that we're winning under first past the post, maybe it's not so bad. And I believe that between 1997 and certainly 2001, the population, well, maybe not the population, but the chattering classes believed that Labour was pretty much there for good and the Conservatives were done. And obviously at that stage, why would they change? It benefited them. And of course, we then come to 2010 when suddenly it doesn't benefit them anymore. And we're back to square one.
If you were to become an MP in this by-election, would you try and work with other parties, or at least party members who are sympathetic to your views on PR, to try and sort of like pressure Johnson into that? Or do you think you'll be successful enough? Sorry, successful in that? Okay.
No, I would work with anyone that wants to bring in a fairer system. But no, you can't be successful in a parliament where there's a majority of 80 for a very regressive politics. I say a majority of 80. I think in their hearts, most of the Labour Party are on board with the PR argument, but of course the leadership is not. So.
And one thing on that, you're talking about John Major earlier. How do you feel about his comments about his sort of dismay and disgust at the current Conservative administration on issues like Europe? And I think he's been critical of them on the sleaze issue too. How do you feel about the fact that he is saying all this stuff? And what do you think that speaks to in the Conservative Party changing from his days to Boris Johnson's current administration?
Well, one of my fondest memories of John Major's election in '92 was how I, as an early 20s student at that time, I thought the day he was elected was the worst day of my life. I thought it was really sad for society. I thought everything was. You often get asked, what would you say to your younger self if you could go back in time? And I would say to that person, you know nothing. You just wait and see what's to come. The one thing with John Major's era, because of course he was mired in sleaze a lot, at least the MPs had the dignity to stand down when they'd done wrong and not just say, so what, it's my right to do so. And that is the big difference here, which is why I do feel myself being quite supportive of a lot of the statements he actually says, not only on that, but also obviously on things like Brexit.
And how do you feel like in terms of like political direction, like Major, if I'm not mistaken, was elected on sort of like a being sort of like softer, more centre right sort of thing, as opposed to Johnson, who was as long as it was a populist. Well, why do you feel that the Conservative Party establishment at least has sort of at least changed in rhetoric over the last sort of 25 years to be a bit more populist and right wing in its approach?
Oh, let's be clear. The Brexit vote in 2016 was a radicalization event. Our society fundamentally changed in that debate. People were made far more entrenched in their positions, be they liberal or nationalist, and they haven't backed down from those positions. So I'd put it to you, if you were to go back in time to 2015, you wouldn't recognize the country we are in now. The opinions that virtually everyone had on Europe were moderate, whether they were moderate pro or moderate against. No one really cared about European regulations. And on the other side, perhaps nobody really espoused the freedoms and took full advantage of all the rights they had then. And that event changed our society fundamentally. It fractured a consensus. And I think it's going to be a very difficult thing to ever recover from.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that one of the reasons, like a lot of the EU debate, at least during that time, was so divisive, is because a lot of people, a lot of the figureheads, maybe on both sides, were more adopted their positions not because they knew very much about the European Union, but because it was sort of like more tribal voting that they're all right wing, so they naturally had to be anti-EU, that sort of thing.
No, I don't. I don't think so. There was some of that. That obviously, and let's be honest, the nastier people were attracted to the Leave side of the campaign in terms of attitudes to social inclusion and racial equality. That is certainly for sure. But there was quite a lot of cross-party alliances in those days. I mean, let's remind ourselves, Liz Truss was one of the prime spokesperson for the Remain side at the time. I think she took on Johnson in a debate. I mean, maybe in retrospect, that wasn't such a good move on our part, but obviously now rotated 180 degrees.
And how do you feel like a lot of these Conservative ministers who were once so pro-European Union because of all the trade and stuff are now sort of like parroting these talking points, which, you know, they probably wouldn't do if their side had won, so to speak?
Well, I think it exposes the deep weakness and cynicism in those individuals. You look at those people and you see people without any integrity whatsoever, quite frankly, because you just don't change your view. If you can give, now, I'm not saying nobody ever changes their views, but unless you can give me a good reason why you suddenly change from being very pro to being very anti. David Cameron was reasonably honest in that, you know, I think we should have stayed in. I'm not having any more part in this now because I can't. And I think there's an awful lot of other Conservatives who, if they hadn't been just looking out for their careers, would have taken the same route at that stage.
Mm-hmm. And on the subject you talked about John Major earlier, do you think maybe one core constituency of your party might be sort of like more moderate Conservative voters who might have supported the days of John Major and would rather have that sort of thing than say people like Johnson and so on?
Absolutely, it is. A couple of our biggest supporters are former Conservative MEPs, and indeed our candidate in Cheshire-Manamshire was a former Conservative MEP who was standing to try and make exactly that point. We only have one policy. You cited us, I did correct you this time, you cited us as left-wing earlier on. I don't think we are. I think we're the ultimate centrist party. All we're arguing for is joining the biggest peace project on the planet and the greatest economic system. I don't think that's particularly radical. I don't think it's particularly left-wing. So that's our only policy. And anyone who looks at the problems that our nation is facing and says, you know what, actually, greater links with Europe would be the way forward, we literally are the only voice saying that at the
moment. Sorry about the misclassification there. Anyway, one other thing is, you talk about about some of these people. Why do you think politics in Britain has moved so much to the right then in recent years, just beyond the Conservative Party in general, it seems, at least according to electorate?
Oh, Brexit. Brexit was waving a big nationalist flag. Using dog whistles to try and polarize people, forcing people to choose a tribe that they had to commit to for life, if not a very long time. Brexit is the single most divisive cancer that this society has had. And quite frankly, even if our side had won, I think, well, I like to think if our side had won, we'd have been a little bit more gracious. We'd have tried actually listening to what the real concerns of people wanting to leave Europe were and trying to go as far as possible to address that. But it would have been an equally big fracture.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about some of these, your biggest supporters being former Conservative MEPs. Who's sort of like the biggest supporter of your party, either in politics or otherwise?
Do you mean financial support?
Oh no, just like name supporters, because you were talking about like Conservative MEPs earlier who backed you, like any big names. I mean, who were just giving vocal support.
No, I think a lot of people are keeping their powder dry in the political environment, because, and I do feel that a lot of people just don't know what way to jump. A lot of people are thinking, well, maybe I should stay involved with the Labour Party. Maybe I can change their views. Maybe Keir Starmer isn't forever. Or maybe I should go back to going out on the streets. And a lot of the people that we talk to try to be politically neutral, try to talk to us whilst at the same time engaging with the other political parties as well. So I would say in terms of our hardcore support, we've probably got, I think we've got a mailing list of around about 250 people at the moment, a little bit more than that, who are really keen to be involved with our project, and uniquely with our project. I think a lot of other people really are politically lost. They're in the wilderness. They don't know where to go.
Mm-hmm. And one thing you talked about with the Red Action interview, which I talked about earlier, was the fact that the main thing to you in the mayoral election, which I know you also stood in the London mayoral election, was the main thing you were concerned about was not necessarily winning, but getting like millions of people to recognise your name so they can vote for you in future elections. Like,
I don't think I ever said that.
Oh, sorry, just that's the way it came off.
I would very much like I would very much like somebody who was very big on the Remain campaign to step forward and start to take leadership on this. There are so many people sitting quietly muttering behind Twitter about how awful everything is and our desire to rejoin the EU. I would like one of them to step up and start actually leading a movement back.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think that's the case then, that they're more in, like, because given how loud and sort of boisterous a lot of the people's vote campaigns and stuff like that were, why do you think that they now are not being as boisterous still? Like you say they're on Twitter and stuff like that. Why do you think they're not out there campaigning or like being big supporters of your party and stuff like that? Like, why aren't they doing more groundwork?
Let's be blunt. For many people, 5 years of total failure is a hard psychological blow. You get beaten down again and again and again. You go on demonstrations, you achieve nothing. You have elections, you achieve nothing. And in the end, you just have to have a rest. Now, I'm hoping that that's what those people are doing at the moment. Just saying, you know what, with a majority of 80, there's not much we can do at the moment. Another election's at least 2 years away. I hope they're just having a little rest. But my worry is that while people are sort of relaxing and getting some me time, so to speak, over this period, the whole issue of rejoining the EU could potentially go out. I kind of like to think of us as a bit like the Night Watch people, just sort of making sure that we don't completely see the elimination of the idea of rejoining the EU, and hopefully activists will soon start getting a bit more active again.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there'll be like a crunch point that will come in like the future in terms of like our relationship with the European Union as it stands? That'll make a lot of these activists get off, like as you say, get off Twitter and is go and do groundwork again.
I think a lot of them just don't know what to do. How do you oppose what you see as a disaster? They've gone on marches, it didn't work. They've formed action groups, it didn't work. They've written to their MPs, it didn't work. They've lobbied members of the opposition parties, it didn't work. And obviously, we've not won any elections yet, so in most people's eyes, we're not working as well. So I think you're right. There will come a point where people think, oh, let's take action. But what do they do?
Mm-hmm. And looking back, like, you talked about like David Cameron earlier giving that referendum call. Why do you think he did it in hindsight, especially given the fact that, if I'm not mistaken, he was very pro-EU himself?
Oh, I think he thought it was. I think if you want to win something, you ask a very stupid question where the answer is obvious. And I think he thought he was asking a really stupid question. I think he thought he was asking, do you want economic prosperity or do you want catastrophe? And when the population said, oh, we'll have catastrophe, please, he didn't know what to do with that. And I'll be frank, I don't think that's just his problem. I think a lot of us on the Remain side were quite smug. It's obvious what's going to be the best for our country. We'll make the arguments, but really we don't need to make much of an effort. And of course, many people were caught out and surprised by the result. He wanted, of course, to try and deal with his Eurosceptics in the Conservative Party once and for all. I think in a way he was following perhaps even John Major's example, where he famously invited the, I'll use the word on your podcast, but you can edit it if you wish, where he famously invited the bastards to, as he called them, to put up or shut up, and defeated John Redwood in the subsequent leadership campaign. I think Cameron thought he was going to do more radical of that. I think the problem was, and I think this was a problem with the EU as well, Cameron went to negotiate this wonderful deal that he was going to bring back to the UK. And what he brought back was rubbish, and everyone could see it was rubbish. I mean, it was, the comedians at the time were paraphrasing it as things like, although Europe still has the right to choose the biscuits, we have the right to choose at what time they're served during meetings. It was really trivial, low-key stuff. And, even people who were hardened Euro supporters were looking at it saying, really, David, that's all you got?
Mm-hmm. And how do you feel that a lot of people like have sort of animus towards him now, because he sort of just like stood down when the things went against him pretty much, and the fact that, as someone said on BBC Politics Live a couple of years ago when they were talking about his memoirs that had come out, for the record, they said he just essentially he'd walked off whistling pretty much.
Yeah, I don't know. To be, I wouldn't want to be David Cameron for all his money, because to be an utter failure in the eyes of history, a joke to the population in terms of everything you've ever stood for and achieved, I think the ignominy of it must be, and now, of course, we have the grubby little sleaze allegations as well. I mean, to go down in history like that, no. So I imagine he went off cheerfully whistling to try and put a brave face on what was utter humiliation and a complete pointless career at that stage, quite frankly. So no, I don't think he's laughing and joking. I think I would have thought he's a very broken person. I certainly would be if I'd been in that position.
Mm-hmm. And if you think David Cameron didn't go for that referendum and instead just sort of stayed the course on the European issue instead, and he stayed on afterwards in general, like he just continued his political career, do you think his reputation would not be as dented as it is now? Do you think it was people still elevate him?
You mean if he'd sort of
he didn't have the referendum instead? He didn't have the referendum and just carried on being prime minister.
There was certainly a lot of guiding steps that could have been done after that to heal the wound. And quite frankly, whether he did it or whether Theresa May did it, it could definitely have been handled much, much better. Talking about the actual relationship that we were going to have, going back to the population saying, do you still want to be in the EEA? Do you still want the single market? Do you still want freedom of movement? Rather than this harsh, fanatical, no, we must be seen to deliver the hardest possible Brexit, would definitely have been a way to smooth things over. And let's imagine we'd followed the referendum to the letter, that we'd gently exited the EU on the basis that it was a close vote. We exited the EU, but remained in the EEA. What would you have now? You'd still have people like me quietly muttering on Twitter, oh, still be better if we're in the EU, but that's all it would be at this stage. But no, we had to go for the hardest possible of all Brexits, and now, of course, businesses are failing. People are suffering as a result of it.
Mm-hmm. And how do you feel the fact that some, even on the Leave side, or at least were anti-European Union, like at one point had supported what you were saying about staying in the EA, staying as, like, if I'm not mistaken, the Norway option it was called. People like Peter Hitchens, people like Christopher Booker, who wrote the co-authored The Great Deception, which is often seen as the Bible of Euroscepticism. Why do you think it went from sort of like that position to something a little bit more hardline, a little bit more maybe fanatic even?
I think you have to bear in mind that to be successful in politics, you have to up the ante from your rivals. So I think there's a lot of people in politics that call for something, even though they expect to get something less out of it. So if I can sound tougher than my opponent by saying, I demand a full Brexit, I demand we sever our ties from Europe, and then someone else says, no, I demand we go further, I demand we put boats in the channel, I demand we send the Navy after fishing boats that come into our water. And then eventually you get to a stage that actually everyone's shouting so raucously, the raucous shouting becomes the policy.
Mm-hmm. And how do you feel like the Conservative Party as of now, at least in rhetoric, is more akin to, say, maybe Nigel Farage than populists of that type, as opposed to people like David Cameron and John Major?
You mean
in terms of rhetoric, anyway? In terms of like rhetoric, it was stuff.
Again, rhetoric wins votes. One of the things that's always tricky in a democracy is appealing to people's minds and not people's prejudices. It's always much easier to appeal to the prejudices of the majority if you want to get in power. And when you have a principleless government, or let's say a principleless party that's prepared to do that, then of course they always have a natural advantage.
Mm-hmm. And one of the last questions I wanted to ask you is about the by-election. Is if you lose this by-election, what do you plan for your political future and for the future of the Rejoin EU Party?
Well, I'm not going to be devastated if I lose this by-election. I think it very unlikely I would win this by-election. And to be frank with you, Edward, I don't even know how I'd cope if I got my deposit back, because we don't even have any accounting systems in place to actually deal with that. So we are very much there to, but from my point of view, it's always been a moral thing, in that I don't have anyone that I can vote for. So if I can, it's my duty to provide people who are similar to me with somewhere to vote if there's no other candidate that speaks to them. And quite frankly, even if I leave the election with 30 votes, I'm quite happy that that's 30 real people who actually got the option to express that view rather than just have to sit at home or spoil their paper.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and this is the penultimate question of the interview, because this is what my show is called and it's what I ask all my guests. What would your ideal world be?
My ideal world would be one without nation states. In the 21st century, it's pointless to have nation states. It's artificial tribalism of the worst type. Our problems are on a global level. Our catastrophe is on a global level. Our economics are on a global level. Our companies are on a global level. We need governments on a global level.
Okay. Anyway, but the final thing I wanted to say is if people wanted to find out more about your campaign, what you stand for, and, how to vote for you and stuff like that, where can they find all this information?
Come to the Rejoin EU Party. I'll get the website address right. Come to the rejoineuparty.com for our basics. At Rejoin P is where we are on Twitter, and that's probably where we have the majority of the interaction. We just launched a brand new YouTube channel, and there's some quite great content coming out on that. So hopefully, if you click to our Keep Informed button, we aren't a membership organisation. We don't believe in being one of these organisations that takes flea bites from your bank account every month. So there's no cost to being involved with us. click to join our mailing list, and we'll make sure you're tied up to our YouTube channel too.
Okay, thank you for coming on, and have a great evening. Good luck with your
And
campaign.
you, Edward, been great to meet you. Love
You
to
too.
do this.
Bye-bye. Bye. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and share this video, as well as subscribe to the Ed Interviews YouTube channel, and also the Ed Interviews BitChute channel, and also look at my stuff on Mixcloud as well. I have more of this content coming in, and also subscribe to my Patreon subscribe star as well for more guest requests, as well as free copies of my old books. Until then, see you next time, guys.